May the words of my mouth and the thoughts and meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. Marley was dead. I'm sure more than a few of you recognise the opening words of one of the great stories in English literature, one of the great and much loved stories in English literature. Marley was dead. Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. And the story, of course, isn't about Marley, but it's about Marley's business partner, Ebenezer Scrooge. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone was Scrooge. A squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. Classic Dickens, like that is just brilliant, just brilliant. And as the story proceeds, there's a transformation that takes place in this tight-fisted, squeezing, grasping, clutching old sinner. And at the end of the book, at the very end of A Christmas Carol, it is said that he became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as this good old city knew. And some people even laughed to see the alteration in him. Well, we're not going to be studying Scrooge today, but we are going to be looking at a biblical character who undergoes not quite as dramatic a transformation and alteration as Scrooge, but nonetheless, there are enough parallels for that Scrooge story to have come to mind as I read the story of Jacob in the last week or so. Jacob, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were in the book of Genesis, which tells the story of these three patriarchs, these three men. At the very end of Genesis, Jacob is there. He's on his deathbed. His sons are with him. And he utters his final words, words of encouragement, words of blessing. It's a wonderful scene. Gather round me, my sons. But we're not there yet. We've got a long way to go. Back in July, we started a little series, an off-and-on series, an occasional series in the book of Genesis. We spent a few weeks looking at how God singled out Abraham and promised him a son, and in due time descendants who would be as many, as numerous as the stars in the night sky. And Abraham was told, they will live in a land flowing with milk and honey, where they will prosper, and they'll become a great nation, and they'll prove a blessing to all. All this God promised to Abraham, you may well remember. That was the dream. That was the covenant, the agreement that God made with Abraham. Well, Abraham and Sarah were promised a son who would carry forward all of that, Isaac, and the baton was passed to Isaac. He inherited that covenant with the promises and the dream, the blessings that God would be with him. I will be your God and the God of your descendants. You will be my people. And today, through October, we're going to continue with that story. So where are we up to? Abraham, tick. Told that story a little bit. Isaac, tick. Isaac's now married to Rebecca, and she's expecting a child, her firstborn, but something doesn't feel right. One modern retelling has Rebecca feeling so uncomfortable that she says, if this is the way that it's going to be, why go on living? And she cries out, why, oh why is this happening to me? And she calls upon God. What's going on? And word comes back to Rebecca that there's not one child, but two children in her womb. You're having twins. And the two boys are already butting heads, tumbling and kicking one another and jostling. And it foreshadows something. One will overpower the other. The older will serve the younger. A lot's going on in that scene. When the time comes to give birth, sure enough, it's twins. And the first comes out reddish, and they name him Esau, which may mean hairy, Esau. And another follows immediately, clutching his brother's ankle, and they named him Jacob, which may mean heel. And from the start, a picture is being formed of Jacob. He doesn't like being second. He's born grasping at his brother's heel. Oh, he was a tight-fisted, grasping, clutching sinner, was Scrooge. And I think we're meant to think something similar about Jacob. I once heard a story, and I think it might have even been told by David Short, who some of you may remember from St. Michael's. He told a story about how people would catch monkeys in Africa. They'd find a tree with a small hole in the trunk, a narrow-necked cavity, a hollow, in which they'd place food, lollies, something sweet, goodies. And the monkeys would put their hand in and they'd grab onto whatever was in there and they'd maintain it in their grip. And even when people approached, they wouldn't let go. They'd remain clutching and clinging, and they'd be trapped. I don't know whether it's a true story, but I do remember whoever told it, and it may or may not have been David. He spoke in terms of being tight, closed-fisted, grasping, and the contrast was with being open-handed, being generous. Well, Jacob grasps Esau's heel when they're being born, and before long he's grasping at other things that Esau has possession of, the privileges of being the firstborn, the privileges as they were then of his father's inheritance and blessing. This is how it happens. One day, Jacob was cooking. He was cooking a stew. And Esau, his older brother, comes in from the field and he's absolutely famished. "Give me some of that stew, I'm starved," he said. "It'll cost you," says Jacob. "I'm not just peckish, I'm not just hungry. I'm famished, I'm starving, I'm desperate. Take what you want from me, but just give me some food." "What about your rights as the firstborn, Esau? Will you give me those?" "Whatever," says Esau. "Swear to me," says Jacob. And Esau did. He swore an oath and traded away his rights as the firstborn for some bread and lentil stew. As it says in some translations, Jacob took advantage of Esau and traded his birthright as the eldest for a mess of pottage. He's a bit of a rogue, isn't he, here at the beginning of our story? There have been all sorts of words that I've come across in the last week or so to describe Jacob: a scoundrel, a schemer, a swindler, a crook, a rascal, a wheeler-dealer, cunning, rip-off merchant, an opportunist, a cheat, a liar, a manipulator, and so on. I prefer a tight-fisted, squeezing, grasping, clutching bit of work like Scrooge. Not only does he grasp and take hold of something and take something from his brother, he deceives his very own father, and this was our reading for today. And here we see Jacob in cahoots with his mother. It happens when Isaac's old, very old, and all but completely blind. Isaac had a favourite son, and it wasn't Jacob. It was Esau, the eldest. He was more of a man's man. He liked the outdoors. He was a hunter. He had a scent and a strength to him. Jacob was more of a mummy's boy. He spent time around the kitchen. She liked having him around. They were both a bit sneaky, and they teamed up, tricksters, the pair of them. Rebekah and Jacob, and here's how the story goes. Isaac wanted a meal, a hearty meal, his favourite meal. So he calls Esau to hunt, to chase down and capture the sort of game that he would prepare for his father to enjoy. And then he'd bless him. And then it might even be time for him to die. Esau goes off to do that. He's in his element. But Rebekah has overheard it all. And she and Jacob are also in their element, conniving. And they have a meal prepared of 2 goats in a hurry that Jacob, in disguise, brings to his father, who relishes it and bestows the blessing that was meant for Esau on Jacob. It was reserved for the eldest, his favourite. But he's been fooled. And Jacob, who couldn't quite manage to jostle his way out of the womb to be the firstborn, has nonetheless now obtained what he wanted: the rights, the inheritance, the blessings of the eldest. And that's where we finish our story for today, with Jacob having secured the birthright from Esau and the blessing from his father, the Bekorah and the Barakah in Hebrew, which both properly belonged to his brother in the normal scheme of things. There's more to come. It won't surprise you that the 2 brothers have a massive falling out. It's a pretty dysfunctional family. And poor old Rebekah, well, Jacob heads off and she never sees him again. And it may not surprise you that the deceiver ends up being deceived. Jacob's tricked a bit later on by his father-in-law and then by his own children. And it's part of the family's way, as we read on, to see them all playing favourites. Jacob will do that with his sons. Joseph, fancy coat, all that. We've still got more than 20 chapters in the book of Genesis to go before we get to that scene that I mentioned earlier. Jacob, surrounded by his sons, the ones who become the 12 tribes of Jacob, the 12 tribes of Israel. And there's going to be a name change as well, a rebranding. Jacob is going to become Israel, and there's the beginning of that change, that transformation or alteration that I mentioned earlier. Not quite as dramatic as Scrooge's, but certainly by the end, with his sons gathered around him, Jacob is less tight-fisted, less the clenching, grasping, more open-handed, more generous at the end. There is a transformation to come. But from today's section, one of the things we see is this: how God works through imperfect vessels again and again and again. God can take a flawed individual like Jacob and use them to achieve something. It is this trickster that God settles upon to take the baton and to become a partner in the covenant, through which he'll realize, partially at least, the promises made to Abraham. He's a flawed, imperfect partner, but he's a partner in the covenant nonetheless. God is with him. And so often in the biblical tradition, that seems to be God's way. He advances his purposes, his redemptive purposes, through not the one you'd expect. Think of David. David's not the eldest. His elder brother is much more impressive, much more impressive. The Apostle Paul in the New Testament says God chooses the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. He chooses the lowly, the humble, the weak things of the world, so that the strong and arrogant and upright can't boast. It's also doggedly anti-elitist, anti-meritocracy even. The first shall be last, the wealthy shall be brought down, with God choosing to work through the flawed, through the last, and the least likely. A humble, crucified Messiah, for goodness sake. It's there in the Jacob story for sure, and I find that whole biblical theme to be both a comfort on the one hand and a disturbance on the other. It does both to me. I conclude by saying that Genesis is, of course, not only the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's also the story of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And in the next few weeks, we'll continue with Jacob's story, but we'll also continue with God's story to breed a lucky people who would someday bring luck to the whole world. That's something that I read during the week. That's how one person put it. I prefer to say that next week and the week after that and so on, we'll watch a narrative unfold in which God shows grace upon grace upon grace to a select and flawed few, in order that in time the whole world might fully experience His amazing grace. Amen.